Hey there, Reconciled Church. Pastor Kevin back with another in our series called From the Cutting Room Floor. So, I do these Bible studies from time to time basically because in the process of compiling information and thinking about what I want to deliver on a Sunday morning, often there's things that I'll write about and I'm like, ooh, I want to talk about this some more. And then for the sake of time, I'm like, it's a little bit off topic to I don't want to necessarily, go off on a tangent that doesn't make sense with the overall whole of the topic. And so I tend to save these kind of things for little studies like this. And one such topic, I should say, involves the word Sheol, or it's in Hebrew, Sheol. Vowels are a little tricky in Hebrew, so however you say it, that's how it's said, okay? But we first encounter the word Sheol in Genesis, and it's in our story we just looked at. When Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, they take his coat of many colors back to his father Jacob, drenched in blood, and when he sees this, he says, I will go down to Sheol mourning. So, it's a weird word, and it's intentional that they didn't necessarily just translate it. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that means. One of the reasons translating Sheol is a little bit tricky is because there's multiple meanings that you might find with this. So sometimes Sheol means one thing in one section, and it might mean something else in another. And you have to determine in terms of context and other things that I want to kind of talk about how we're to understand that. So translating the word Sheol becomes tricky for a couple reasons. First, we often read our New Testament understanding back into the Old Testament without warranted sometimes. Therefore, a lot of people hear Sheol and they go, oh, you should just translate that as hell, right? Like that's just hell he's talking about. Well, not exactly. One, Jacob probably didn't think he was going to a place of eternal punishment after he died, being God's man, God's chosen man, and the recipient of his grace, his mercy, and his covenant. And so it would be wrong to simply take all the things we understand in light of the New Testament and then just read them back into the Old Testament. We want to understand that the Bible is something that is revealed to us progressively, and it was revealed to the authors progressively. So it should come as no surprise that when we get to the New Testament, those people have a more fully orbed understanding, a more clear understanding of death and the afterlife and things like that. Sheol doesn't necessarily mean what Christians mean when they say hell. For example, this week when we came across its use in Genesis chapter 35, verse 35, like I said, Joseph believes his son's killed. He says, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Now, Jacob's, like I said, he's not saying he's going to a place of torment for his sins. Rather, what Jacob is showing here is that he will go down to his grave. He will die mourning. He's saying basically, for the rest of my life, I'm going to be mourning the loss of Joseph. Second problem that comes with this is that the word does not, as I said, always refer to the same thing. So not every time when we read the word Sheol can we necessarily translate it the same way. Let me show you some examples of this. Most oftentimes the word is found to be used of death, meaning just somewhat the place of the dead, not necessarily discriminately looking at the righteous or the wicked, but just generally the place where dead people go. And then in another sense, it's used of things like the grave, or some translations read from the ground. This fits in with the passage from Sunday, obviously. Jacob's saying that he will go to the grave mourning. He will go back to the dirt mourning. This fits also with the description of death that we find in Genesis. So, remember, we're studying through Genesis. How did God present death to Adam and Eve? Well, Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. He said to Adam, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and dust you shall return. So, going to Sheol is to some extent going back to the dust you were formed from. It's a way of showing what death is. It's going back from where you came. God describes death to Adam as returning to the ground from whence he was created. Therefore, it would make sense that Joseph would use this same meaning. He is saying that he will return to the ground in sorrow because Joseph has died. However, not every use of the word Sheol fits this narrow category of from the ground or the grave. Take, for example, David's use of the word in Psalm 16. He says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore." So here, Sheol is described as the place his soul would go to. We also see a contrast here between Sheol being a place associated with death and decay or corruption, and life, which is characterized as the presence of God and characterized with joy and pleasure and things like that. So we see this contrast between the presence of God here and Sheol on the other hand. Now, interesting thing about this psalm, Peter would later go on to quote this psalm in his sermon at Pentecost, and he used it specifically as a reference to the resurrection of the dead, and specifically Jesus' resurrection. He says, he basically said, if you look at David's soul absolutely went to decay. He died. Bones are still buried somewhere today, right? But Jesus is the fulfillment of that. And so he, though he died, he went to the place of death. It was not, he didn't decay, his body didn't rot, he didn't stay there. He came back. And so there's significance with that. Let me give you another reference. We see a slightly different use in Jonah's story. This is how Jonah describes being in the belly of the fish. Jonah chapter 2, starting in verse 1, he says, "Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you have cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea, and the flood has surrounded me. All your waves and billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple." Okay, so there's a couple things here with Jonah's use of Sheol. First, Jonah wasn't dead. He was swallowed by a fish, but he didn't die there. And so he's not necessarily simply saying that he was in the place of the dead. It's a metaphor. Often it's used this way as a symbol for something else. What Jonah is saying is he's explaining his state in the belly of the fish, and he's saying, I might as well be dead, basically. I was as good as dead, and I called to God, and such. And ultimately we see God rescuing him. But also we see a similar idea here where being in Sheol, being in the belly of the fish, is seen as being away from the presence of God. Jonah sees him being in the fish as being a sort of punishment, being cast away from God. But he's saying, even from there, I cried out to you. Obviously, like I said, Jonah didn't die. We also, but there's another thing that this kind of touches on. Often we find Sheol compared with like a massive pit. So you'll hear Sheol usually often in the Psalms referenced as like those who go down to the pit. It's talking about going down to death. The pit is seen as a type, death is seen as a pit from whence no one comes out of. Or also sometimes the depth of the earth, or in the case of Jonah, it's even referenced to as the depths of the sea. It's under the earth, or underworld, as you might think. The Bible has this concept to some extent of the underworld, the place of the dead. David also calls down another example that's helpful, another use of Sheol to bring out. David calls a curse down on the wicked in Psalm 55:15. He says, "Let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is in their dwelling place and in their heart." So, clearly, if they're going to Sheol, they're going down to Sheol alive, he's not talking about dying. It wouldn't make sense to say, let them die alive. It doesn't make any sense. So David's understanding here of Sheol is somewhat different. He's referring to it, he's not referring simply to a physical grave here. I bring this up also because you might say to yourself, Kev, why are you bothering with this? Well, a lot of folks who want to deny the existence of hell or the idea of um, an actual place of torment for souls after they die, like to state these things and say, well, Sheol just meant death in a general sense, or the grave. Therefore, it's sort of a non-existence that people go to when they die. The Bible gives us descriptions that paint a picture very differently. Now, it's also important to understand that something that helps us understand the word Sheol is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament is known as the Septuagint, and it's helpful to understand because it gives us an understanding of how the Greek world would have understood some of these Hebrew words. We understand what they translated those words to mean. And specifically, when we get to Sheol in the New Testament, the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Sheol is the word Hades. Hades is referred to in a similar way as Sheol in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament. But the New Testament adds a little greater depth to this, to our understanding of death and the afterlife. So we start to understand Hades is not simply a place where people go, but also a place where people are conscious and such. In Revelation, Jesus declares, Revelation chapter 1, verse 17 through 18, he says, "Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades." Okay? So, clearly he differentiates between death and Hades here. What Jesus is saying is that he has authority not only over physical death, but he has authority over the souls of the dead as well. And so Hades is the place where the souls of the dead go. The word that we translate hell in the New Testament is Gehenna. Now, to illustrate the difference between these two, it's a little bit tricky, but bear with me on this one. Hell refers to a more specific place, the place of the wicked. Okay, that's where the wicked go. When they're cast away from God's presence. Hades can be a more general sense where all dead people go, all the souls of the dead go when they die. To use like an illustration, it's helpful to think of the difference between speaking of going to a state and going to a city. So I could say I'm going to Nevada, and that's a bit of a broad term. I could be going I could be going to Vegas, I could be going to Henderson, I could be going to Carson City, whatever like that. But if I say I'm going to Reno, we understand that it still falls under this broader subcategory of Nevada, but it also is more narrow. Sorry, Reno, by the way, you get to be hell in this analogy. Nothing against you guys. Been there before. It was all right. So, anyways, it's helpful to understand that the difference between these things because if we read too much into it from our New Testament understanding, reading back, we might be assuming that the authors had a bigger understanding of these things than they did, and we might miss the meaning that they had in that text. And I think the same, and you can get some pretty wonky doctrine that way. Take, for example, our passage for Genesis. If you assume that Jacob is saying he's going to hell and that Joseph went to hell, we start asking the question, well, wait, what? Like the patriarchs went to hell? Like they seem to be the example of those. They're used some of these men are used and referenced in the New Testament as being men of faith and things like that. So we don't want to get crazy doctrines like that. And so that's helpful. So a couple things just to kind of wrap up. Couple keys for interpretation when you come across a word like this. I think the word Sheol is a good example of something that we find a lot in the Bible. So on one hand, when you come across a word you don't understand, look at the surrounding context. This is probably the most important thing. Let the Bible interpret the Bible. Okay? We don't want to so quickly go off and go, what did this mean to the Greeks? What did this mean to these ancient people? That might be helpful in studying the word, but often the Bible will take a word that was used, a contemporary word, and fill it with new meaning. So if you remember when we were talking about the Gospel of John during Christmas time, John takes the word logos, and he doesn't necessarily mean what the Greeks meant by logos, but he takes the concept, so it's something that they can relate to, and then he adds new meaning to it as well. So let the Bible define the Bible. Let the Bible interpret the Bible first and foremost. Always allow the author to let you know the way in which he's using that word. And then also consider the book as a whole. So it's helpful to understand, hey, how does this fit the greater understanding of the book you're reading? Like I said with Genesis, it's helpful to understand that death in Genesis is described as going back to the earth. And so saying someone is going to Sheol is a good way of saying they're going into the grave, into the ground, and referring to physical death. Also, and I want to be cautious as I say this, but I want to encourage you, if you have questions like this, it's an easy Google search also. So if you want to, Bible word studies and things like that are like easy, are right at your disposal on the internet. Now, be aware, not everything you read on the internet's true. I can't believe I actually have to say that. Not that everything you read in a book is true. What I should say is not everything on the internet comes from a reputable source. So check your sources. But quick Google search, Bible word study, Sheol would give you a lot of good understanding on this. As you come across other words, it's helpful to do this. Be willing to refine your thinking over time. This stuff it's not always easy, but I think it's rewarding. It gives us a fuller understanding of the Bible the more we study things like this. So that's what I have for you guys for this week. I hope you have a great week. I'm going to see you guys Sunday. Keep studying your Bibles. God bless.